Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So I'm Jun Yang, the director of the Institute for Corporate Governance at Indiana University. So today we have a very exciting lecture, which is also a very timely topic. And this is truly a global seminar series. I'm hosting this today from Singapore. Our speaker, Alex Edmans, is in London, and the moderator, my colleague Stephanie Wang, Professor Wang, is in Bloomington, Indiana. So we have launched this whole series. Today is number 23, and this series of public lecture on corporate governance was hosted by Kelley Institute for Corporate Governance, and our co-hosts are the ECGI and IU's Ostrom Workshop. So before I started today's lecture, let me put the advertisement for the last one in this year. This is going to be given by Professor Kelley Xu from Yale University. The topic is incentives and promotions. So this is number 24. The time is a little bit different. So that's on May 2nd, noon to 1:15 Eastern time. So please take out your devices. I'll stop here for 15 seconds. You can register for the event now. All right, so ESG related discussions are well needed. And our lecture series has had a series of discussions. And actually, the inaugural lecture of the entire series was given by Alex Edmans, the very same speaker for today. And the title of that lecture is ESG, Do We Need It? And does it work? The answer is yes and yes. After that, we have several lectures on similar and related topics: climate risk, ESG with the system level investing, sustainability, and we also talk about governance of certification agents, including the ESG raters. And last December, we hosted a similar discussion, which is well needed, greenwashing, ESG investing at crossroads. Today, we have Alex Edmans, another lecture on this. Can we trust ESG research? So this is a very needed and timely topic, and this is both for scholars and practitioners, because we have so much discussions on ESG related issues, and people have different conclusions drawn based on different evidence or no evidence. So Alex is going to lead the discussion for today. So now I'm going to introduce today's moderator, Professor Stephanie Wang. Stephanie is my colleague at Kelley School of Business, and she's associate professor, Samuel Pauline Glaubinger Professor of Entrepreneurship. One of her research interests is intersection of internationalization and social environmental sustainability. And she's associate editor for the Global Strategy Journal, a guest editor for Journal of International Business Studies, and so on. So one thing in common between Stephanie and Alex, they are both featured by Paul and Kwong. Stephanie is the best 40 under 40 business school professor, and Alex was the professor of the year of Paul and Kwong a few years ago. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the podium to Stephanie to introduce our speaker, Alex. Stephanie.
Thank you so much, June. Well, first of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to moderate this great session. So first of all, welcome all of you from all over the corner. I see now we have 500 plus attendees, so this is amazing. So if you're joining for the first time, welcome. If joining for multiple times, welcome back for all those great old friends. So, and then also I want to say that it's not only just about speakers, so do use the time to post the chat, post your questions in the Q&As, and then we will go back to your questions. All right, so I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker, old friends. As June talked about, Alex started our inaugural lecture, and then now is our episode 23. So I think Adam Edmans really needs no introduction to many of us, as he has so many amazing achievements already. So just I'm trying to highlight a few among of his many achievements for people maybe new to the field and maybe new to this research. So as you can see, Alex Edmans is currently a professor of finance at London Business School. He got his PhD from MIT as the Fulbright scholar, and was previously a tenure professor at Wharton and investment banker at Morgan Stanley. So Alex has spoken at World Economy Forum, testified in the UK Parliament, and given TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, and TEDx Talk, The Pie-Growing Mindset and the Social Responsibility of Business, with a combined 2.8 million views. This is amazing. So I think Alex is truly a great spanner between academia and practitioner. So with a lot of great insights, both from academic and also from the applied work. So Alex also has a lot of books, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, was a Financial Times Book of the Year and has been translated into 9 languages. He's also a co-author of Principles of Corporate Finance. He has won a lot of awards, including the Pros and Cons Best Professor of the Year in 2021, as Jun has highlighted. He's a fellow of Academy of Social Science. And what is really exciting for me is his latest book, May Contain Lies, How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases, and what we can do about it, which will be published in April 2024. So we're all very excited, look forward to read the book. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over the virtual floor to Alex. Alex, please take it over.
Well, thank you so much, June and Stephanie. It's great to be here. It was really an honor for me to kick off the seminar series. And I'd just like to congratulate June and the ICG for all of the success that the series has had since then. It's really great to be back. So what I'm going to talk about today is a topical issue and an important issue, which is, can we really trust ESG research? So there's a lot of ESG papers produced now, and what is really great is this is a way in which academics are having a real influence on practice. So we typically think academics, they sit in an ivory tower, write stuff only read by other academics, but ESG is a field in which many papers are having impact. But the question is, are the results of those papers actually supporting the claims that are made? So let's try to scrutinize them. So I'm trying to speak to 2 audiences here. So looking at the people who are attending, some of you I know are practitioners. So what are the simple questions that you can ask to see, can you trust research? And others are academics. So what are the pitfalls that you might fall into, which we can avoid when producing research ourselves, and importantly, when communicating it with the outside world? So to kick off, let's talk about a great member of the profession who we sadly lost last week, Danny Kahneman. So Professor Kahneman, he obviously made a huge contribution to academic research, but what was impressive was his impact on the real world, most notably his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which has sold millions of copies. And in this book, he talked about 2 thinking systems. So there's system 1, which is the impulsive thought system, which is operated by the amygdala, which is one part of the brain which is affected by emotion. And there's also the rational system 2, that's operated by the prefrontal cortex, and that is logical. That's what he calls slow thinking. Now you might think, well, that's all well and good, but what has that got to do with ESG? Kahneman wrote about many things, but he didn't really write about ESG. It has everything to do with ESG, and in particular in how we interpret ESG research. Why? Because there's a big problem of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the idea that if we see a study or we see a headline which confirms what we would like to be true, we will lap it up uncritically and accept it. And notice this is an issue with both sides of the spectrum. If you're an ESG advocate, you would like to believe a paper which shows that ESG pays off. And there's also people who are ESG skeptics who would also jump at believing a paper which supports their viewpoint. And so why is that so dangerous? When confirmation bias is so strong, it will activate our system 1. So many of the things I'm about to say in terms of distinguishing correct and incorrect data, you might think, in the cold light of day, I knew that. Like, I know the difference between correlation and causation. But that is your system too. That is your rational thinking system. Yes, in the cold light of day, a number of papers which have had impact might not have deserved that impact. But when our system one is an overdrive, then we don't typically think rationally. So even if you think you know some of the things that I'm about to go through, they are not always practiced when it comes to a study that we like the look of. And just to give you a little bit of preliminary, how strong confirmation bias is, it is so strong, it is hardwired within our brain. So there's two types of confirmation bias. One is a type which I call blinkered skepticism, which is we will just rule out a study whose conclusions we don't like. We might not even read it, and if we read it, we'll read it with the mindset to pick it apart. And so there were some neuroscientists who took some students and they gave them two types of statements. One of them was a political statement, like the death penalty should be abolished. The other was a non-political statement, like Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. And then after reading the statement, and they chose the statement so that they were some that the subjects agreed with, they then gave them some contradictory evidence which were knocking down that statement. And they hooked them up to an MRI scanner, and they found that the part of the brain that was activated was the amygdala. That was the operator of the system one. That is the same part of the brain that is activated when we're attacked by a tiger and we have a fight or flight response. So people respond to evidence that they don't like as if they're being attacked by a tiger, rather than rationally taking it and looking at the methodology and the strength of the evidence. Now, the flip side to blinkered skepticism is something known as naive acceptance, which is if there's a study we would like to be true, we will accept it, no questions asked. And again, there's evidence behind this, again from some neuroscientists. What they did was they took an initial statement that people agreed with, and this was in the Bush-Kerry election. So here is some Kerry supporters. There is also some analogous statements for Bush support. So, statement like this. During the 1996 campaign, Kerry told a reporter that Social Security should be overhauled. Then there was a contradictory statement which attacked their hero's credibility. So, Kerry later pledged that he will never tax or cut benefits to seniors, so he wouldn't overhaul the social security system. So that's problematic. You're a Kerry supporter. Kerry made the statement, and now he seems to be going back on himself. But then there's a third statement, which was an exculpatory statement, which excused the sudden U-turn, such as the social security system will not run out of money until 2049, not 2020, as experts had previously thought. So maybe you can excuse the U-turn, you don't need an overhaul. And so they hooked people up to the MRI scanner, and they found that the part of the brain that was activated was the striatum. That's a dopamine-rich area of the brain. It releases dopamine. That's the same feel-good chemical when we have a great meal or go for a run and end up with runner's high. So again, this releases good chemicals. If we see something we like, again, that could activate our system one and mean that our system two is not working. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the different ways in which the findings of research may be misunderstood. Now, to illustrate my points, I will have to use some examples of studies that have been widely misrepresented. Now, let me be clear about this. So when I go through these examples, I'm not going through these examples because I take delight in bashing papers. These papers I've chosen because these are papers which have had huge amounts of influence. They've influenced my thinking. In some cases, I've written about these papers because I wanted them to be true myself. Those of you who know my work, I would like to believe that ESG pays off. So I take no pride in highlighting some issues with some papers. But the reason why I'm doing this is that I need to illustrate what the issues are with some practical examples, not hypotheticals. And I hope the constructive spirit comes across in what I'm saying. So the purpose of this talk is to be constructive. There's huge problems in society. There's problems with economies stagnating. Companies might not be profitable. Now, if improving social and financial performance was as easy as claimed by some of these studies, we would not see these problems. But the fact that we see these problems persisting suggests that the simple findings of some studies may not actually be borne out of the data, and therefore we need to be much more nuanced if we are to give suggestions on how to invest money and how to run companies. So if any elements of the talk appear sharp, this is only to highlight the danger of biases, the cost of misinformation, and the size of the stakes that we're talking about when we're thinking about ESG, which is, can we address some of the biggest problems in society in financially profitable? So with that caveat and with that context, let's get to the first set of issues, which is how do we measure ESG? Lots of studies want to link ESG to performance, but how do we measure this? And so what I'm going to take is a really influential book called Firms of Endearment, which talks about the benefits of conscious capitalism, companies that are serving wider society, not just shareholders, something I truly believe in. And so what they wanted to do was find a list of companies with strong humanistic performance that meet the needs of stakeholders other than shareholders. So how did they do that? Well, what they did is they polled people and they asked them, tell us about some companies you love, not just like, but love. And this gave them 60 or so companies, and they wanted to refine them. And then they got some MBA students, teams of MBA students to research them. And again, they asked them to gauge what is the extent to which this company was loved by its stakeholders. And then they found that these firms of endearment, these companies which are loved by its stakeholders, they delivered superior profits compared to the average market. But notice, how did they identify these companies? These were companies which were just seen as companies that are loved. And so these are successful companies, right? So if you're asked to find out which of the companies which are loved, they're probably going to be Apple and Amazon and these highly successful companies. And even if you were very clear in your instructions and you were to say, highlight companies that were loved by their stakeholders and not their shareholders, there's a big problem of the halo effect. So the halo effect is if you see a company or a person as being good on one dimension, you see them as being good on lots of dimensions. So people might say Apple is a great company. Say they think about innovation, they think about how useful a smartphone is. Yet there are problems with labor relations in the Foxconn factories, but we gloss them over. If we think that this company is good, we say it's loved, even though it might not be. So that's one problem, is that measures of ESG, a lot of them are other people's perceptions. Often our perception of a company will be driven by financial performance. And if we show that ESG is linked to financial performance, that is somewhat circular because you're having other people's subjective assessment of the company's value creation to wider society. Another problem with ESG measurement is, are you truly capturing ESG or just good management? So here is not a study linking ESG to financial performance, but it is an influential article about ESG, again, from an organization I really respect. I actually use this particular study in my teaching. And so they think about, well, how do we use ESG to affect valuation? And they here say, well, we should change the discount rate to reflect ESG factors. Corporate governance, that's clearly an ESG factor. That's the G on ESG. But then operational management, general quality of management, strategic decision making. That is not ESG. That is just good management. So ESG loses its meaning if we try to ascribe to ESG anything that is just general good management practices. So another problem with measures of ESG is, are they truly capturing ESG value creation to wider society, or just good things that companies should be doing? Because if so, then you're showing that good management pays off, but not so much ESG. So my third example on this topic is this McKinsey study, which is a blockbuster study. McKinsey's released a lot of studies, and this is probably their most influential, which is on the benefits of taking a long-term mindset. So here is an article about it. They said the McKinsey Global Institute found that companies with a long-term view, something that is essential to stakeholder capitalism, outperform the rest in earnings, revenue, investment, and job growth. But there's two problems here. First, they're saying this is about stakeholder capitalism, but they're measuring it with taking a long-term view. But those are quite different things, right? Because taking a long-term view is just good management. Your only goal as a company could be profits. If your only goal is shareholder value, but you pursue long-term shareholder value, that is not stakeholder capitalism. This conflates two different things. Your horizon, are you short-term or long-term? With your objective, is it shareholder value or is it stakeholder value? But let's say we cast that aside. Let's say we want to measure a long-term view. How do McKinsey measure the long-term view? They look at things such as how much a company invests. But that is an input measure, not an output measure. When you look at companies that are good ESG, you would like to measure companies that deliver good ESG performance. They create a lot of value for wider society, not so much that they're spending a lot of money. Any sports fan here will know that the teams that spend the most on players don't deliver the highest results. So here, they're not actually measuring the quantity of the output, but the input, how much do you spend? And in my last talk here, I highlighted the paper by Alon Brav, Wei Zhang, and co-authors on innovation. So what they found was that after hedge funds come in and engage with the company, the level of expenditure goes down, but the amount of patents goes up. So when you look at how much you spend, you might actually get a sign that these are short-termist, but actually they're not. They're generating a lot of output. This is what you want to measure. Okay, so my first part was about how do we measure ESG. The second part is how do we measure financial performance? Again, these studies correlate ESG with financial performance. And so there's a very influential BlackRock study recently on lifting financial performance by investing in women. Diversity is something which I'm sure is important to a lot of people on this call, including me. But how do they measure financial performance? They looked at return on assets. But BlackRock is an investor, right? And as a fund, when you advertise your funds, do you advertise the return on assets of the companies you invest in? No, you advertise the total shareholder return. That is what we care about as an investor. Some of the most valuable companies in the world today, tech companies, they have valuations, they have total shareholder return much higher than return on assets, which is a short-term measure of performance. It is not forward-looking. So often the measures that we look at are not what we actually care about. Now, another problem with measures of performance is the following. So another respectable, highly reputable company, EY, the EY Sustainable Value Study finds that companies acting on climate change realize above expected returns across 5 sources of value. Great. Then act on climate change, deliver high output. But how do they measure value creation? Here, what they said is more than 2/3 of all respondents report that they capture higher financial value. So this was purely self-reported performance. So what companies did is they did climate change initiatives, and you obviously can't see in the data how these initiatives do because you just look at aggregated performance across the whole company. So you have to ask people, did your initiatives do well? And there's a huge behavioral bias known as cognitive dissonance. If you invested in a project, you won't say, oh, this project did badly. You are going to say that the project did well because you want to justify your initial decision to invest. So again, here, the problem is the measure is self-reported. Is it performance? No, it's self-reported performance. Again, we need to be skeptical. Okay, so my first 2 points were about how to measure ESG, and this problem is even greater with ESG than most other financial studies because ESG is so nebulous. Sometimes we have to have other people's perceptions. Sometimes we have to have input measures, not output measures, and sometimes we measure things which are general good management. And then performance, most investors would care about total shareholder return, but if you have something different, we need to be skeptical. But let me shift gears from the measure. Let's say we're happy with the measures that a study has. Well, then there are still some problems we need to be careful of. And one is statistical significance. Now, when you look at statistical significance, that doesn't sound a sexy thing to talk about. That sounds like something that only statisticians care about. Is this something, if you're in the real world, matters to you? It does matter. So let's give an example from Harvard Business Review. Again, highly respected. I write many times for them. And they have a lot of influence in their articles. And this is an article co-authored by Paul Polman, who I truly respect. I wrote about him a lot in my book, Grow the Pie. So the article was called, Yes, Investing in ESG Pays Off. And he says, a growing number of companies prove, very strong statement here, prove the payoff from focusing on long-term value in ESG. Just Capital has created a list of companies prioritizing stakeholders, not just shareholders, that they call the Just 100. This group has outperformed the market. So what are the problems with that paragraph? Well, you already noticed one problem, hopefully, from what I've said earlier. A list of companies prioritizing stakeholders. Well, how did they come up with that list? What do they measure? Was it truly prioritizing stakeholder performance? Was it just perceptions? Was it just good management? Often people just don't ask that question. They take this off the shelf. They just assume that they've come up with this perfect measure of stakeholder capitalism. But what did they truly measure? But the new point, which I'm putting on this slide, is the following. This group has outperformed the market. What is the probability of outperforming the market? It is 50%. Well, even if this was completely random on any particular year or month, the probability of outperformance is 50%. So this is what statistical significance is about. It is not just something that academics get really excited about. It has tremendous practical implications. Why? Because, well, what drives stock returns? There is a lot of luck. Sometimes it could be that I'm not a great stock picker, but I just do really well because I'm lucky. What statistical significance is about is the magnitude of the outperformance so large, and is the sample size of the outperformance, the number of companies, and the number of years over which they outperformed large enough that we can rule out the effect of luck. So that is one issue. So here's another. So this is another Harvard Business Review article, actually a spotlight article, which was not just on the website, it was in the magazine, by George Serafim, perhaps the most cited academic in ESG, and someone whose work I have probably written about more of his work than any other academic in my first book, Grow the Pie. And so what he took was the following statement. When colleagues and I looked at data for more than 3,000 firms between late February and late March 2020, when global financial markets were collapsing, we found the ones the public perceived as behaving more responsibly had less negative stock returns than their competitors. So the idea was that in COVID, companies were collapsing, but the ones who were responsible were not collapsing as much. Again, sustainability pays off. What are the problems? Well, our old trend, how do we measure ESG? The ones the public perceived as behaving more responsibly, that is others' perception, that might be highly correlated with their actual performance, so it's circular. But the new thing for this section is this. Between late February and late March 2020, that is 1 month. That is far too short a period about which to form inferences. And the crazy thing is, imagine this paper had found the opposite result. Let's say you found that in this 1 month, that socially responsible companies had underperformed. Well, then this would be triggering your amygdala. And you would be saying, oh, 1 month is far too short to make claims. But when it's a result in the direction we want, we suddenly forget about this. We accept it uncritically because we want it to be true. So we need to apply the same discernment to studies that we like as studies we dislike. We have the critical thinking faculties within us. I'm not talking about doing a Monte Carlo simulation or understanding statistics. We all know basic things such as time period and sample size, but we deploy our intelligence selectively. Only when it suits us to be critical will we be critical. Okay, so now I'm going to get to a fourth concern, which is data mining / robustness. And again, you might think that the problems that I highlight are problems that you see in many areas of economics research, but they're particularly problematic in ESG Why? Because there's so many ways that you can cut the data. There's so many ways in which you can measure ESG, and there's a lot of other things that you can do in order to get the result you want. So what is data mining? This is the idea that you could run hundreds of different tests with different measures of ESG and only report the one specification that works, and you hide all of the others. So let's take one study by BlackRock on board diversity, which is what I measured earlier, what I mentioned earlier. So they use lots of different measures of board diversity, and they chop and change their measure from paper to paper. So first, they measure the quintile relative to your peers. So are you in the top 20% compared to your peers in board diversity, or the bottom 20%? Then for another set of tests, they measure how close you are to 50%. And that's different. That's an absolute threshold, not a threshold relative to peer. For example, if everybody has board diversity below 50%, then actually your closest to 50% would actually lead you to being in the top quintile of everyone. Yet, if you're thinking that this is distributed uniformly between 0 and 100, if you're close to 50%, you are now in the middle. Then they look at your diversity relative to the rest of the workforce in a completely different specification. And this seems a strange measure. Why? Because if your workforce has no diversity and your board has no diversity, then you have perfect alignment, but people would never claim that that is a diversity. Then they change again and they form a diversity portfolio subject to these things: 100 basis points ex ante tracking error, industry and full investment constraints. I don't even know what this means, and they never explain what this means. So what this highlights is they want to measure board diversity, and they measure it in 4 different ways, depending on the type of result that they want to do. Now, one could argue that one of these measures is better than the other, and reasonably you can disagree. So maybe I will think a relative measure is good, maybe June would think that an absolute measure is good, and reasonably you can disagree about this, but you pick one measure and you stick with it, and then you perhaps show robustness to the alternative measure. You don't chop and change the measure for the test that you're running. Otherwise, the concern is, well, they ran this one for other tests, it didn't work, so they changed it to different types of measures. And not only do they do this with their measure of diversity, but they also do this with their measure of financial performance. So they start with return on assets, which, as I highlighted, is problematic. But to their credit, they do later tests using the total shareholder return measure that I advocate. But they first do alpha, which is your abnormal total shareholder return, related to the market, which they measure with the MSCI World Index, and also the size and value factors which Farmer French came up with. Then they do the same for another test, but they forget about the Farmer French factors. They only measure it relative to the MSCI World. And then in another set of tests, now the market factor is the Russell 1000. It is not the MSCI World anymore. And then in another set of tests, they don't even look at financial performance at all. They look at employee turnover. And again, you see what this problem is here, where if you are just chopping and changing your measures, then you have a concern that the authors ran lots of tests, are showing just the measures that worked. Now, it could be that for different types of tests, actually different outcome variables are relevant. But if so, you need to justify this, explain why you've switched your measure, and be upfront. And then this is something where people have got confidence that why you do it, it was based on some economic rationale, not because it gives you the result that you want. And so that's a way, as researchers, we might be able to avoid some problems where we're accused of engaging in data. Okay, so as a practitioner, what do we look at as a reader? Chopping and changing. Now, McKinsey have a series of reports on diversity. And so what do they look at? They look at earnings before interest and tax. Now, they don't consider any other measure, but then there was a replication study done by 2 professors, Green and Hand, and they found that if you were to run the same test with different measures, gross margin, IA, IOE, sales growth, total shareholder return, it doesn't work. So the concern is they just pick this measure and not other measures because they don't give them correct results. But there's another problem, which is not necessarily in the black box, which is what they do is they throw away data. They link diversity to whether a profitable company has profitability above or below average. So one of their headline results is that if you have more diversity, you have a greater likelihood in having above average profitability. But is this the measure we actually care about? Like, do we want to be just above average? If performance ranges from 0 to 10, increasing performance from 4.9 to 5.1 now means that you become above average. But does that count as a win? Should it count as a win? Well, in McKinsey's view, it shouldn't, because McKinsey's own mission statement is to help our clients make distinctive, lasting, and substantial improvements in their performance, not just to be above average. Right, the average finishing marathon time for a man is 4 hours and 21 minutes. If I was to sell you a shoe or a training program by saying you can be above average, you can beat 4 hours and 21, I'm probably not going to be selling many shoes or training programs. So we don't care about just being above average. So why is this the ultimate measure? So you might think, well, have I misplaced this slide? Should this not have been on the first section where I talked about which is the measure of performance? Being above average is not something that we care about. But why I have it here in the data mining section is that when you throw away data, you look at the likelihood of being above or below average, that gives you a huge ability to data mine. Because McKinsey could have also looked, what is the probability of being in the top decile, or the top quintile, or the top quartile, or the top tercile? There's so many different ways that they could have cut the data that if they have not shown robustness to those other measures, then we need to be quite skeptical about. So the final example I will give of concerns is alternative explanations. So let's go to the McKinsey study linking diversity to financial performance. So what they find is a strong correlation. And so they find that companies with greater board diversity deliver higher performance under their measures. I think it was earnings before interest and tax. However, one big problem is it could be reverse causality. Maybe once the company is already performing well, then it has the headspace to think about diversity. And indeed, how they measured their variables was really odd. They looked at performance in 2017 to 21 and diversity in 2022. They measured diversity after the time period in which they measured performance. So that makes it much more likely that performance led to diversity rather than the opposite. Now, just looking at timing is not enough to prove causation, but certainly with this timing, it is much less likely that diversity caused performance. It's likely the other way. Yet this school child error, that's such a basic error, was never picked up. Why? This was a study that people like the look of. You might think, why did I bother sort of dialing onto this call and learning about something like this? This is so basic. I knew this before, but people didn't know this. They didn't even look at this methodology because the result was so powerful, their system one was an overdrive. And what is the other problem? Well, there's common factors. Economists call this omitted variables, but in my book, I call it common factors in more layman's terms. There are the things that could lead to both diversity and performance. A great manager both improves the performance of her firm and also improves her company's diversity. Or let's go back to McKinsey's other study looking at the value of a long-term mindset. If you take a long-term view, maybe you're improving performance, and taking a long-term view, you do invest in the diversity of your board. What is striking is McKinsey comes up with so many reports claiming here's all of these other factors which are linked to financial performance. They fail to control for any of those measures, despite having claimed in so many other papers that there's so many other ways to predict financial performance. Now, at this point in my talk, 40 minutes in, well, I applaud academics who've stayed for 40 minutes, because to academics, you might think, well, I knew all that. Like, we know correlation, causation. We learned this in a basic class. And all of the studies that you've taken are practitioner studies. This should never happen with an academic paper. And indeed, on my website, maycontainlies.com, where I try to highlight papers, I typically will take practitioner studies. Why, with academic articles, there is a forum to have academic discussion, which is they're presented at a conference and you give a formal discussion on this if you're invited. Maybe they presented in a seminar, and those are the forums in which academic debate. However, there's now an academic paper that I will share, which unfortunately does fall for a lot of these problems that I've highlighted. And I'll explain why I'm choosing to highlight this particular paper. But again, before I do this, let me highlight once more the caveats I mentioned earlier. This was a study I really, really respected. I quoted it perhaps more extensively than any other paper in my book, Grow the Pie. It was in every talk I gave on ESG because I really wanted it to be true. And so this is a paper called Corporate Sustainability, First Evidence on Materiality. And so what this paper showed is that, well, if you are investing in companies which are high ESG, you don't beat the market. Simply finding ESG does not lead to outperformance. You need to be more discerning than this. You need to look at the companies that do well on material ESG dimensions, tailor-made for your industry, and which scale back on the immaterial ones. And this really fell into my confirmation bias for a couple of ways. I like to believe that ESG pays off, but I also like more discerning evidence rather than one-size-fits-all ideas that just invest in everything called ESG and it will pay off. This says the type of investment works. And this has had a huge amount of influence on the practitioner community as well as academia, including me. But the two problems that I just highlighted, 4 and 5, they have cropped up. So to Professors Luca Bacicci and Andy King, what they highlighted was a potential concern of data mining and robustness. How did this come up? Well, when you are an academic or researcher, there's lots of different choices that you can make on a specification. When I look at ESG, I look at the level of ESG or the change in ESG. When I map particular companies to industries, there's different ways in which I can say which industry a company is in. And so they took a very agnostic approach. They said, well, we're not going to say that one method is better than another. Let's look at all of the range of the potential different specifications that the authors could have done. And let's look at the different outcomes that they could have had for the outperformance of ESG. And what they found was that the final number reported in this paper was in the 98th percentile of all the potential ranges of outcome. So this doesn't prove data mining, and they never claimed it was data mining. It could be genuinely, this was the only test that they ran, and they just got lucky, and it was in the 98th percentile. But what it suggests is it was not robust. Different ways of cutting the data nearly always gave significantly lower results for outperformance than the initial paper claimed. And then the problem with emitted variables or common factors, this paper is now forthcoming in the Accounting Review just a couple of months ago, highlighted that when you control for basic factors, size, value, and growth, again, the outperformance goes away. The outperformance of ESG companies could be fully explained by their size, by their value, and their growth opportunities. Now, the concern with this is that when you have other papers highlighting some potential issues, well, this doesn't necessarily imply there was anything particularly sloppy or fraudulent about the original paper. This is how science evolves. Different methods come up and different methods highlight that actually things are now different. And so if you are in a position where your paper's results have now been replaced by something better in terms of more advanced methodology, that is fine. We move on. This is how science evolves. But what was concerning was that one of the authors wrote just about a month ago this article in Harvard Business Review highlighting this study, even though these problems had been highlighted, and said, well, in part as a result of our paper, ESG investing took off, and refer to it as my foundational paper. And so this is why this was one of the rare papers in academia that I thought it was useful to cover on my website. Why? Because the problems had been highlighted, but despite the problems, they hadn't really had any impact on practitioners, people who will be making investment decisions with pensions money, with their clients' money based on studies like this. And if when issues come up, then these issues are buried or ignored, then I think that is a problem. And so then what had to happen afterwards? Well, there's an editor's note where actually now these claims had to be retracted So rather than as a result of our paper, ESG investing took off, that's now some attributed the paper to ESG investing take. So I've thrown a lot at you in the last 40 minutes. So let me just sum up everything that I have here for practitioners and then for academics. So for practitioners, when you see a paper, how do they measure ESG? Is it perceptions? Is it just good management? How do they measure performance? Is it self-reported? Is it statistically significant? What is the time period? Is it a month? What is the sample size? Was it just 28 companies and firms of endearment, or was it thousands? In terms of data mining, do the authors chop and change their measures? Do they throw away data by looking at whether you're top half or bottom half? Do you check robustness? And finally, alternative explanation. Might there be reverse causality? Are there common factors that might cause both? Now, again, I highlight that none of these questions require a PhD in statistics. They all require common sense. And typically, if you have a study that you don't like findings of, you'll typically apply these checks. But you might still think, okay, there's still a lot of things here. Maybe I just can't ask those questions. I just don't have to. So is there a shortcut that you could do if you just didn't have the time to ask those questions or you haven't got in the habit? Here's one. Imagine the paper found the opposite result. How would you attack it? So go back to the paper which looked at February to March and found that ESG outperformed in that 1 month. Let's say I found the opposite result. ESG underperformed in that 1 month. Well, how would you attack it? You would say 1 month is far too short to form inferences. And therefore, this would alert you to the fact that sample size is an issue. So again, if you imagine the opposite result, find what the problems are, then you think, do these problems still apply, even though the result is in the direction we want? Also, you might think, well, imagine the paper had found the opposite result. Would the authors have published it? So there are now a lot of companies getting into the idea of research, such as McKinsey or BlackRock and EY. But sometimes this might be advocacy, not research. If you look at the small print, they actually have, this is a marketing document. So why they write these papers was not scientific inquiry, but to build their brand. Would you ever release a paper showing that sustainability does not pay off? Probably not. Now, this doesn't mean that their answer is wrong. Sometimes what you want to be true is true, but it means that we have to be particularly careful. Whereas with academics, there are lots of academics who've written papers with unpopular results, like diversity not paying off or high CEO pay being good for firm value. Also, what are the authors' credentials? So if the authors had found the opposite result, would you believe them? So sometimes people will believe a study by some authors without expertise in scientific research, without scrutinizing their credentials, because they like the result. Whereas if the result had been opposite, they would say, well, I've never heard from this particular university, so I'm not going to place any weight on it. And one thing which people in the real world might not fully understand is often we refer to studies as a study by Harvard University. Now, Harvard University does not release studies. McKinsey releases studies because McKinsey needs institutional sign-off before it can. But Harvard University does not give institutional sign-off. Anybody with the slightest affiliation to Harvard, maybe you're a visiting lecturer, maybe you're a master's student. I saw Harvard Business Review have an undergrad thesis by somebody, which was released as an article there. So there is not a study by Harvard. Well, who wrote it? Is it a scientific researcher with a lot of experience and track record of scientific evidence, or is it just somebody doing a master's? And then for the researchers here, what if you can't answer the questions? What if you don't have good answers for, is it correlation or causation? Or just to be upfront. Like, papers are never perfect. The bar for publication is to make a significant contribution to knowledge, not to find proof. All a paper needs to do is to shift our price. And even if you don't take us all the way there to 100% nailing result, it can still make a contribution. I do research in ESG, and I know that sometimes my measures have problems of endogeneity. Just to take one recent paper called Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, our measure of DEI could be correlated with a whole host of other variables. But in that, I'm just showing this not because it's the world's best paper, but that's a paper we had to write extremely carefully because our measure has there's lots of alternative explanations there, but we still think it's a worthwhile paper because even though it's not definitive, it will hopefully move out. Okay, so just before Q&A, if there's people want to read this topic longer, I wrote this book for Penguin. It's coming out later this month, just to highlight these statistical issues in layman's terms, highlight how they are important. They're not just issues that academics should be squabbling over, but they are issues that affect how we make decisions as investors in those companies. And there are a lot of examples of misinformation which have come out after I've completed the book, which I put on the website again in layman's terms. And again, I highlight the intent behind all of this is to be constructive, to highlight when we cannot make full inferences from a paper, and then this guides our readers to where we can make inferences and we can truly trust readers. Thank you so much again for the opportunity, and let me now hand back to Stephanie for the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. Great, thank you so much, Alex. So this is really great. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Can ESG research be trusted? I think what you shared is really beyond ESG research alone. It's really the broader questions in terms of for academia. How do we ensure the relevance and usefulness of our research, right? So thank you. We have a lot of audience post a lot of questions. We also have audience providing question ahead of time. So I will, given the limited of time, I will probably group your questions and then together and then ask something so that we can make the best of our remaining time. So one of the questions, Alex, I think, as JB kind of alluded, is I think the ESG is really complicated. So it's multifaceted, right? I mean, the term itself, ESG, and today some people even add ESGP, political, right? So ESG issues has a lot of contextual differences in terms of industry, right? Carbon emission is very different from some social sustainability issues because social questions are really different across different countries, across different industries. We also know that today in academia, we have a lot of newer techniques to address some of the indigenous issues, research design, definitive, or DDD. So a lot of the things, right? So basically, let me push you a little bit more in terms of the question about can we trust ESG research? Do you think some of the biases or some of the not irrelevance may be due to that we group ESG together? So if by separating ESG, looking at ESG issue separately, and then looking at different contexts, will that help alleviate some of the concerns we have?
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions, and there's a lot of richness in the questions that were asked. So one point which was mentioned is, well, do we group ESG together, and should ESG be grouped together to begin with? Because it seems strange, because the E and the S are about serving wider society, whereas governance is typically seen as being in the interest of shareholders rather than stakeholders. And indeed, I wrote a paper last year called The End of ESG, saying, well, actually, we shouldn't think of ESG as a homogeneous entity. Typically, governance might be different from the ENS, and within the ENS, that comprises a huge range of things. Some of them might be financially material, like human capital or employee satisfaction. Other things might not be so financially material, like Catholic values. So it might be that one of them pays off and the other doesn't, so it's not actually clear that we should lump them together. And indeed, there is a new paper that I've written, it's not yet released, where we surveyed 509 equity portfolio managers about ESG, and what a lot of them said is that we need to have research which is much more granular and context specific rather than taking an aggregate ESG score. I know that people have been asking about these ESG metrics from MSCI, but these aggregate ESG scores and correlating them across performance in a large scale data set. Instead, let's think about the business context. There might be certain ESG factors that matter more in some cases than others. That's why I was so drawn to the materiality papers that had that granularity. But as we know, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So even if the results of that paper don't show that their specific way of chopping up the data leads to higher financial performance, it may well be that other ways which you take into account materiality do lead to the result which is behind that question. The second thing which was asked about is, what about the climate skeptic sponsored research where there's some lobbyists going on? And then we need to be very, very careful about that. So certainly I know that some of the papers I've been highlighting the issues with are pro ESG papers, but there will be lots of anti ESG papers where also people have an agenda other than the truth. And this is again why I would put more weight into academic study. Why? Because with academic studies, you have to disclose your financial support. There have been papers published in top journals and then accepted in top journals and then retracted because they haven't disclosed their financial support. Whereas if you're a climate lobbyist, you've got incentives for other than the truth. Just like if you're a McKinsey, you have incentives to release the result that gives you good PR.
Great. We also have audience talk about ESG risk. So Irene talked a little bit, Robert talked a little bit, right? So far, I think a lot of our discussion focus on will ESG contributing to performance? So that's a question mark. But if we think about different angle, Alex, thinking about ESG risks, right? So if you do not engage in ESG best practices, if you have, and then basically if you are not checked all the boxes of being a good citizen or whatever. And then if you have all those risks, so that might backfire, right? So in other words, although maybe proving ESG has a statistical significance or whatever effects to improve performance, but ESG risk may be another thing that broader stakeholders should consider. So what's your view about that?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. And this, I didn't plan these questions, but these are great because they are related to some of the findings in my survey. We haven't released the survey at all because we're still working on it. But one thing that equity portfolio managers seem to highlight was that ESG may matter more on the downside rather than the upside. So ESG risks, if you are, say, a Volkswagen cheating emissions test or Rio Tinto blowing up Juukan Gorge, that can lead to a huge negative effect on your company's long-term performance. So it might be that to some extent it's the hygiene factor where bad ESG hurts your performance more than good ESG helps your performance. And again, this is important in terms of granularity. So rather than taking an aggregate ESG score, it might be that we want to consider ESG opportunities, ESG positives, and ESG negatives separately.
Right, yeah. Particularly when we talk about ESG practices, many of those are risky themselves and also costly, right, for firms short term. So are we creating value? Yes, we are. So we have value creation, but the problem is probably value distribution, who got what, right? So eventually the society is getting better with better practices from the ESG, but who, in terms of firms rewarded because of ESG, that might be a different question. So I want to ask you another question. I think many folks mentioned is, okay, so now acknowledge there are some imperfect research design measures, statistical techniques, what we have right now, right? So let's be a little bit forward looking. You already mentioned some suggestions, Alex, right? So just giving us a little bit more in terms of what we can do in the future, right, to improve the relevance and the usefulness of academic research. So what do you say?
So I think just to increase the relevance and usefulness is to ensure that you don't have a number of the issues that I've highlighted here. So just to make sure that if there are emitted variables, if there are issues with sample size, to be upfront about that. So studies will never need to get to 100% proof in order for this to move our priors and in order for this to lead to a positive contribution. But it could well be that if we are to make too strong claims, then if there are ESG detractors, then they might pick on our weakest argument and say, well, if indeed this is the best that the ESG people have, then that will invalidate all of the ESG research which is done out there. So there is a great TED talk by one of my colleagues, which is called The Counterintuitive Way to Be Persuasive, which is to say that 3 great arguments and 1 good argument are worse than 3 great arguments, because you can always be beaten by your weakest argument. And I think to highlight the benefits of ESG research, we want to refrain from making over claims, no matter how passionate we are about a particular topic, because these are things which might not actually be supported by the data.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really helpful. So another question I think many folks talk about is, what do we get ESG information? I think you also started with that about the measures, right? So today, ESG hot topics are hot. So firm, they self-disclose, right? They self-report some of the ESG information. And then we also have third-party organizations, particularly out of media, right? So they rank firms ESG. And then we also have different metrics across different countries. So do you think if we can sort of have a more standardized ESG measures or a matrix across different countries, do you think that will be helpful? Or in other words, how do we make sense of the different sources and then different aspects of the ESG information?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because people say, well, if there was to have one particular unambiguous source of ESG where there was no disagreement, then that would be perfect. But that's unrealistic, because what is an ESG rating? That is an opinion on a company's ESG. Some of these issues are subjective, some of them are forward-looking, just like there's no one unambiguous broker recommendation on whether a company is a buy or a sell, because there's different viewpoints. So there was a question from anonymous attendee. It is clear that Alex is not familiar with the Aggregate Confusion Project at MIT. He should check it out. With respect, I was the editor of the Journal of Review of Finance, which accepted this paper. I have deep respect for this paper. This paper highlighted that there's a lot of disagreement in ESG ratings, and this disagreement is natural and it's human, because some people might argue that actually electromagnetic radiation is not ESG issue. Others might argue that it is. And I thought this paper was so great that not only did I accept it, but way before I even solicited it for the journal, I wrote it up on my website, growthepie.net. So I had a small practitioner's highlight of this, just to show why actually these ratings differ. So often people think, well, these ratings disagree. ESG agencies are not doing their job. They can't even agree as to whether a company is good or bad ESG. But this is because it's subjective opinion. No set of academics will agree as to whether a paper is good or not, or who deserves a Nobel Prize or not, and so on. So just with the same subjectivity, that applies to ESG, because some things are subjective as to how to measure it, or even what we should be measuring in the first place.
Yeah, I love that. So actually, the complexity of ESG issue is the excitement for me. So there are a lot of things to study, and then a lot unsolved questions for us to explore. Due to time limitation, I think we will have to end the session for now, but the conversation won't stop here, right? So we will welcome, we continue the conversation, continue this very important discussion among academia and also among practitioners in terms of how can we collectively make ESG research more useful, more relevant. So I want to thank Alex one more time. Thank you so much for sharing all those great insights from with us. And thank you for the audience providing the questions and then all the great discussions. Again, as I said, the conversation do not stop here. Let me hand over to June. June has a couple of things to remind our audience.
Thank you so much again, Alex. This is such a perfect timing to discuss such an important question, and you are the perfect speaker to start this serious discussion. I know you are in general a strong supporter of ESG research, and you have many research papers on this, but I do think this is the time we should look back on our research methodology and check our confirmation biases. So I think this is an important topic, not only apply to the ESG related research, but also to other academic research as well. So thank you again, Alex. And our next public lecture, which is the last one of this season, is Incentives and Promotions, given by Professor Kelley from Yale University. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope to see you next month. Thank you, Stephanie and Alex.